Welcome back to Classics Unraveled, that show where we decide if our modern remakes are worthy successors of the literary tradition. Coming to you live from the recent past is John Christensen, your host. When I was a young man, Pride and Prejudice was not for me. Big surprise, right? A young man not liking Pride and Prejudice. But it wasn't just the book. It was the book partly. Again, the whole weirdly logistical character of the book, of constantly going from one house to another to go to different parties. It was a hard sell for someone who didn't really know that world. But if there's one thing that's worse than a book you don't like, it's undeserved praise for a book you don't like. And when you grow up around Austen girls who are constantly dressing in empire waists and flocking together to say, "Rita, I married him." That's not going to endear a young man to Jane Austen. I've grown up since then. And when you grow up, you tend to go back to those books you didn't like and decide, was it the book's fault or was it your fault? And now I've read Pride and Prejudice quite a few times, and it's a great book. Pride and Prejudice is a very good book, and I will fight you if you disagree with me. I had to struggle with this book. I had to dig into it, dig beneath the surface in order to really make it tick. But if you like the surface to begin with, there's no reason to dig. And so on goes Pride and Prejudice, year by year, the unreflective favorite of those who don't really understand what the book is about. So here we are, Classics Unraveled, back at it again to explain why you don't like Pride and Prejudice for the right reasons. Now, one of the reasons why this idea or this surface level treatment of Pride and Prejudice persists is that so many of the movies and shows that are built around it are really only delving into the aesthetic of this period of Regency England, because we English speakers have a certain romance, a certain attitude of wistfulness about the England of yore. And when you marry that with a story that is ultimately about marrying handsome men, it's easy for the story to be sort of co-opted into a daydream, into something where we can simply escape into a world that dresses and looks and talks and resolves in a sort of pleasing, bucolic, marital comedy. And it is along those lines that most of the adaptations we're going to talk about mostly decompose. A little while ago, I described Pride and Prejudice as a marital comedy, and it's on that basis that we want to begin our assessment. It is a comedy. It is ultimately about marriage, and we typically do define a classical comedy, a Greco-Roman comedy, as one whose object is marriage. Now let's put a pin in our comedy and come back to it shortly, but now let's talk about tragedy. A classical tragedy is one where the main character has some distinct excellence, something for which they are honored and respected and known. However, it is on the basis of this excellence, or this perceived excellence, that they encounter hubris, where they engage that excellence beyond its stretching point until it snaps. The whole hidden thesis of Pride and Prejudice is that it is both a comedy and a tragedy at the same time, depending on the viewpoint we choose. Let's start with the viewpoint of the actual viewpoint, Elizabeth Bennet. Her distinguishing feature throughout the entirety of the book is the immediacy with which she determines whether someone is good or bad, whether she likes someone or doesn't like someone. Her judgment of the character of Mr. Darcy, of the character of Mr. Collins, of the character of Mr. Wickham, all feed into a comedy or tragedy of errors that beset the Bennet family. Elizabeth's poor judgment of each of the characters involved in this affair led to her inaction at all of the critical points where it would have mattered. She failed to be the protagonist that this story needed. She is someone that we are not supposed to treat as a girl boss who gets everything right. If you're walking away from Pride and Prejudice with Elizabeth Bennet as a role model, then you have missed the train on this book. Imagine, if you will, a stage on which two different plays are running concurrently. They have the same cast, the same characters, and yet one of those stories is happening in the foreground, where you see everything that's going on. And the other one is directly behind them. You see bits and pieces of what's happening, but you can only see it insofar as the foreground players allow you. As the play in the foreground begins to fall apart, it is rescued at the last minute by that play we've been watching in the background this whole time. The tragedy finally becomes a comedy, and the comic protagonist finally shows you what he's been up to this whole time. And by the protagonist, I do mean Mr. Darcy. He is a victim of misunderstanding because of Elizabeth. He's a victim of deception on account of Wickham. He's a victim of rivalry on account of Mr. Collins. And yet, in the midst of all of this, he overcomes the difficulty of his circumstances by changing himself, by finding virtue in the midst of a lack of virtue, by improving himself and proving himself to the object of his desire. Elizabeth's story has been one of denial. Her rejection of the worth of others has caused her family material hardship. But by accepting the worthiness of Darcy's pursuit, she is going to find her own happiness and accomplish her family's welfare. This is the classical core of Pride and Prejudice, a comedy hidden behind a tragedy. A tragic heroine whose chief trait is ultimately almost her undoing. And it's only by rejecting that trait in the 11th hour that she's capable of letting the true hero, the comic hero, accomplish his end of wooing her. Forget about the Regency, forget about the petticoats, this tale is as old as time. What ultimately seems like a story about civilization, of culture, of families, of wealth, is ultimately about the virtue and the vice of individuals, and the way in which they judge and misjudge the virtue of others. In our adaptations, then, we are looking for an Elizabeth whose original pretensions of judgment and of justice are ones that do not hold up by the end of the movie. Our Darcy needs to be someone who is fundamentally good, regardless of his original flaws. It is not a story about Elizabeth redeeming Darcy. It is a story about Darcy redeeming Elizabeth. And to whatever degree the setting, the time and place of the story matters to this adaptation, it needs to be something that either bolsters the vices or dampens the virtues, forcing our characters to somehow rise above them or beyond them, such that it is personal virtue, not institutional mores, that triumph. Where to begin besides BBC's Pride and Prejudice from 1995? This is probably where most Austen girls cut their teeth, so to speak. It's where people really get a very distinct sense of the look and the feel and the smell of Austen's England. Now, BBC in the 90s is still kind of finding itself as far as adapting pieces of literature. It doesn't have the bite of some of the later productions. It's not throwing any punches here. And so its handling of Pride and Prejudice is very delicate. It's very respectful, and it doesn't do a lot to mess with the bare words of the novel. As a result, this tendency towards respect or honor makes an Elizabeth that is just a little bit too nice, and for that matter, a Darcy that's just a little too attractive. I dare say that many people's positive impression of Elizabeth Bennet as a character comes from this adaptation. She has her moments, but ultimately she's portrayed as a smart woman, as a likable woman, and, well, we all make mistakes sometimes. Her relationship to the crises that unfold is mostly an, oh no, how could this happen? Not necessarily an introspection on how her choices led to these things happening. Really, where the novel is hiding the vices and hiding the virtue of Elizabeth and Darcy respectively until that critical moment at the end. The BBC adaptation just hides the vices of both. They are both pleasant and attractive people, and the strong contrast we need there is painfully lacking. Now, this is one of the more beloved adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, so your mileage may vary. But if people are going to possibly overlook or misunderstand the real thematic core of Pride and Prejudice, the novel, they will even more overlook it in this series. 10 years later, we have Pride and Prejudice of 2005, directed by Joe Wright, but you know it as the Keira Knightley one. It's tempting to write this one off because it's so melancholy and romantic. But there are several critical points where Elizabeth's judgment is directly criticized by the characters around her in a way that forces her visibly to think about her choices, to think about her inaction. In particular, I think back to the conversation she has with Charlotte when Charlotte decides to marry Collins. It's a heartbreaking conversation. It really makes you feel for this other character in a way that Elizabeth doesn't really show a lot of respect for until that moment. We also really see that change of mind evolve as she tours Pemberley and begins to realize the real life of this man that she abhors. As for Darcy, he certainly is an overproud individual at the beginning of the story, and yet Macfadyen does a very good job of expressing that pride is a sort of offshoot of his shyness, of his indecision, an indecision that melts away in the face of realizing the pursuit. In just the same way that the book itself kind of led to people taking it the wrong way, the movie does lend itself to be appraised for its romantic nature in a way that can mistake the trees for the forest. Next, we turn the clock back to 1940. Pride and Prejudice, the names are not going to be very creative here, stars Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier, famed Laurence Olivier, as our respective Elizabeth and Darcy. Now, when you hear those names, you're thinking, okay, acting powerhouses. And we do have a habit of saying that older things are better things. This is a terrible adaptation, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, for the cottagecore enthusiasts, you're not going to get what you want. They get the setting wrong, they get the clothing wrong, they get the accents wrong. It's a bit of a mess as far as periodicity is concerned. But worse, they decide to make it just a comedy. They decide to strip away any of the real social difficulty involved with them, any of the real barriers between them and what they want, and it just becomes a matter of will they or won't they. It's basically Love Actually using characters from Pride and Prejudice. And if you don't like Love Actually, you're not going to like this. And if you do like Love Actually, pause the video and walk away. Moving on, we have Lost in Austen, which is, like Bridget Jones' Diary, another vehicle for Austenian wish fulfillment, but of a different flavor. This is one where a 21st century normal girl is magicked away and enters into the world of Pride and Prejudice, replacing Elizabeth Bennet, who goes into our world. Because she knows the novel, she tries to stop all the bad things from happening and tries to make all the good things happen without a hitch. But it all falls apart, but not before Darcy falls very much in love with her. This is not social critique. This is not a tragic comedy. This is a comedy of errors in the most facile sense. We're not engaging with heavy themes here of right and wrong, of personal vice and virtue. It's fan fiction. That's all it is. As for the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, a YouTube series much like this one, it's actually kind of good. It's trying to interact with the social critique of Regency England and apply it in a meaningful way to modern digital media. It's not necessarily effective at every point. The characters are definitely not as strong versions of their literary counterparts, but they're experimenting with something here, and the experiment must be admired. My favorite, and I think the best adaptation of Pride and Prejudice for the screen, is not from this country. It's not from England either. It's from far-flung India. It's called Pride and Prejudice. Now, here's the thing. This is definitely a fun one, and the whole analysis I gave about Pride and Prejudice doesn't sound fun. But that doesn't mean that all the same things can't be present in a story that is full of singing and dancing. Indian cinema is very good at summoning high emotion, and it's capable of transforming the interior struggles of Elizabeth Bennet, or her Indian equivalent Lalita, and William Darcy as opposed to Fitzwilliam Darcy. And for that matter, the setting of this thing in 21st century India does a really good job of coaxing those social quandaries out of their Regency setting and into a new one. The original predicament of the Bennets, which in the novel is largely one of social class, expands into all of these new levels. There's family pressure. There's the strange holdover of influence of Britain over India. There's the power of modern finance and travel across the globe, all changing the minute details of the story, but enhances and livens up that original set of circumstances. For those readers like me who didn't quite connect with the novel at first glance, for those people who were kind of turned off by the staid and strict measures in which the story is told, one cannot help but enjoy the colors and life of how those exact same ideas are presented in Pride and Prejudice. This isn't hard social satire, but it is a social satire. It just has a lot of fun along the way. Conclusion, that's all I have to say. Bryce insists that we talk about Pride and Prejudice and zombies. So here we go. If you've read the book, and I mean the zombie one, then you'll know that this is not really an adaptation as a repetition. of Pride and Prejudice. It is literally the text of Pride and Prejudice, with bits taken out and replaced with zombie bits, where suddenly someone's bitten in the neck and stuff like that. So calling this an adaptation in the same way that we've talked about the others is challenging. And trying to describe this as thematically different or enhanced from the original is equally difficult. Remember what I said earlier about the classical comedy being one where circumstance forces the young lovers who live in a civilization to escape from that civilization out into chaos, out into the world where sudden and unexpected things can change their fortunes? Perhaps a generous frame of mind might allow the zombie apocalypse to be that catalyst for romantic and comedic growth. So, in the end, Pride and Prejudice, it's a good book. It is not that polarizing boy versus girl experience in high school. It's something that has a very distinct classical underpinning that is worthy of its own analysis. But we are so easily lost in that sea of petticoats that the story is forgotten or ignored by a whole half of the population on account of the invisibility of that central kernel. But I invite you to join me, not to read this book as a mere escapist imagining of beautiful times and beautiful dresses and romance and marriage, but rather as an attempt to entirely reverse the structure of classical storytelling as we know it into something new and exciting and interesting, and something capable of realizing virtue in a place we don't typically look for it. Until the next time, I hope you drop a like in the like jar and subscribe to Memoria Press. As always, I am John Christensen. Fare thee well.